This is the Perception of Space Exploration, Comparing Students' Views of NASA and Private Companies by Anthony Morrison. So to begin, a history of the space exploration. So for the most of history, it's been dominated by governments such as the Soviet Union and the United States with NASA. So NASA was formed in 1958 after the launch of Sputnik 1 by the Soviet Union in 1957. And so NASA's been at the forefront of American space exploration ever since then. They have had the Apollo moon landings from 1968 to 1972, the Skylab missions from 1973 to 1974, and the International Space Station from 1998 to present day. And so these have all been like major scientific missions with for civilian projects funded by the government. And so, however, there have been many people in the government who have been pushing for space commercialization, including President Ronald Reagan and Buzz Aldrin too. And so in 2002, SpaceX was formed, and they launched their first rocket in 2008 successfully. And ever since then, they have had numerous contracts with NASA for financial stability. And in 2020, they became the first private company to launch a person into space too. And all of this has been signaling that there's been a general trend in space exploration of moving away from governments and towards private companies. And this has been a major change in the industry ever since then. And for public perception of this, there's only really been public perception polls of NASA because it's a public organization which relies on the public much more than companies do. And so the surveys have found that around 75% of people, since the 1960s, around 75% of people have generally approved of the job that NASA's been doing, and around 80% of people have approved of funding NASA. And all of these polls come from large polling organizations like the Gallup poll and the General Social Survey, which have been sent out every year, and they have data records going back for decades now. And so all of this leads me to my research question. How do American male high schoolers compare NASA and private companies in terms of space exploration? And this is an important topic because the male demographic and male high schoolers are going to be important for the future of the space industry. So first, from 2014 to 2020, men made up 67% of all applications to NASA for jobs. And a study by Nadal et al. Also found that men were twice as likely to support an increase in funding for NASA than women were. And so this means that men are more generally likely to support space exploration than anyone else. And furthermore, high schoolers are the next generation of engineers and scientists and taxpayers who are going to be the main supporting group for space exploration as it goes on into the future. And me personally, I'm interested in this just because I have a familial background. My grandfather worked for NASA as the head of international relations for a long time in the 80s, and my dad has a master's degree in space studies. And so because of that, I've had a lot of experience with space science, and I just kind of picked up this interest. And so on to the lit review. The first is a study called The Scientific Literacy and Attitudes Towards American Space Exploration Among College Undergraduates by Cook et al. And so this study was in Syracuse University in New York. They went to the college undergraduates. They had them take a scientific literacy test. They separated the students according to their major, and then they gave them a survey that tested how much they supported space exploration. And what they found was that the majority of people supported space exploration, but also that most people didn't know a lot about space exploration at all. And so when they tested the scientific literacy, they found that after an adequate amount of scientific literacy, there was no difference. So after a bar was passed, there was no change between how much the people supported it. And they also found that men supported space exploration more than women. And a second study was called Towards Space Science Education, a study of students' perceptions of the role and value of space science program. This was by Offal et al. In RMIT University of Australia. They just surveyed students on what they thought about space science and if they would want like an expanded space science program at their university. And they found that people were generally supportive of it, which has been a theme through basically all of the literature, that people have been generally supportive of space science and space exploration. But at the same time, people don't really know that much about what space exploration is. And so because of that, I chose my method to test my research question of how do male high schoolers view space exploration. I chose a survey. This is because many of my studies and many of the information so far has been done by survey, such as the Gallup polls and the general social surveys. Those are the main sources of data so far. And also many of my mentor studies, such as Cook et al., have used these surveys to be able to like analyze their data. And another option was to do interviews to get more in-depth data, but I decided against this just because I wanted to get as many people as respondents as possible, which wouldn't be possible with interviews. And to analyze the data, I chose a correlational analysis with a one-way ANOVA test and a post-hoc Sheff test to find if there were any correlations between the responses from one demographic group to another demographic group, and if there were any differences between how people answered questions about NASA compared to private companies. And so the survey I used was created in Google Forms. It was split into 4 sections. There was one about space exploration in general, one about NASA, one about private companies, and one was a list of demographic questions. And so here are the results. These are the demographic results. There were 232 respondents, with around half here being lowerclassmen and half being upperclassmen. The racial breakdown of there were only 3 groups that were statistically significant enough to be considered. It was the white group, the Asian group, and the Hispanic or Latino group. And then there's also the political affiliation, which around a third of people said they were generally liberal, a third said that they were centrist, and a third said that they were conservative. And a lot of people answered options like none or libertarian. And then not shown here on the slide, there was also a question about what people's GPA was. It was about 50-50 between 4.0 plus and 3.0 to 4.0. And I also asked what people's knowledge of space exploration previously was. And there was around 67 people who said they know nothing at all about NASA, and around double that for private companies. And so for the questions, the general questions had a mean response of 3.30. The NASA-related questions had a mean response of 3.55, and private companies had a mean response of 3.00 on a scale of 1 to 5, with 3 being a very neutral option. And here were the results when I compared them across demographics. So these two are for political affiliation and race. They both had they both showed no correlation at all. And this is a similar trend across all of the demographics. There was no correlation between GPA or age or political affiliation or prior knowledge or race. And so this led me to some conclusions. First was that people generally supported NASA more than they did private companies. And this can be seen because there was the average response to the NASA questions was 0.55 higher than the ones to private companies. And the ANOVA test did confirm this with a p-value of 0.008, I believe. And so the expected result, this kind of falls in line with what I was expecting, and that was that both would be neutral to positive, and that can be seen because they were both around 3.9 to 3.5. And I expected this because the majority of research so far has said that people don't have that many, or aren't that knowledgeable on space exploration, and because of that, they're not going to have many strong opinions on it. However, it is surprising that there is such a higher amount of support for NASA than there is for private companies. And one reason for this was described by researcher Romanius from the National Air and Space Museum. He described this phenomenon as Apollo nostalgia, which is that people are evaluating NASA today by the achievements they've had in the past. And especially the moon landing, because that's obviously the most prominent and the most well-known achievement of NASA. But also, NASA isn't only the moon landing. They've had numerous other achievements since then, such as more recently there was the James Webb Space Telescope and the Hubble Space Telescope and the International Space Station, and comparatively private companies haven't had that many achievements. And because of that, there's been less media and press attention towards private companies than there have been towards NASA. And this leads to people knowing more about NASA in general and being more supportive of NASA. And the second conclusion, or an interesting result, was that there was no difference in results based on political affiliation. And this was kind of against what I was expecting, because a study by Cobb in 2011 found that conservatives were more supportive of space exploration. And the reasoning behind this was that liberals would be more supportive of social programs and welfare programs. And because space exploration isn't necessarily one of those, they would be less supportive of funding space exploration than conservatives would be. And so my results conflicted against Cobb's. And one study that I found that agreed with me was Nadeau from 2012, who also did a similar study to me. They did a longitudinal study, and they analyzed results of polls, public perception polls for many years. And they found that it was largely a nonpartisan, bipartisan issue. And Nadeau said that it was more the economy that influenced public perception than political parties, because the amount of funding that NASA receives is more based on the state of the economy currently than on one party's preference. And a third interesting finding was that GPA and prior knowledge did not affect responses at all. And I expected that a higher GPA would lead to a greater support for space exploration. And I reasoned this because Cook et al. Study found that a higher scientific literacy led to more support for space science, and Nadeau's study found that when people had more appreciation for organized sciences, they were more supportive of space science. And so I made the assumption that a higher GPA might be more associated with a higher scientific literacy and greater appreciation for organized sciences. And so this is kind of interesting, and there needs to be more research into this, especially with a high school demographic. And the fourth interesting conclusion was that race didn't cause any difference in the results. And I expected that white respondents would be more supportive of space exploration. And this goes back to the theory of Apollo nostalgia that was found by the researcher Lanius. And he said that people wouldn't be only nostalgic for the moon landing, but also the entire 1960s, when the space industry was almost entirely white men. And so these results do contradict that. And I didn't find many other studies talking about racial differences in space perception. So this is kind of a little new. And so limitations in future research. So the population sample was entirely from a all-boys male Catholic high school in Phoenix, Arizona. And so this might mean that because it's a private school, the students might be different than the national average. So there needs to be more research into a larger amount of high schools and a larger population sample. And then there's also the gender, age, and education bias, which is pretty similar to what I just described. How these responses probably differ with different age groups too. So the results aren't really applicable to a larger population, rather than just the students at all boys male Catholic private high schools. And also there were a few broad questions on the survey. One of them might be I asked respondents to rate their prior knowledge of space exploration from a scale of I don't know that much to I know a lot, which is a very subjective scale. And so I wanted this to be similar to the scientific literacy test in some of my mentor studies, but for the sake of time and keeping the survey short, I decided not to use a full scientific literacy test. And so future studies might need to use more they might need to use more in-depth methods of discovering how much people actually know about space exploration prior to, and how, yeah. Thank you. Oh,
Time.
recording.
Mhm.
You're at 15